May 16, 1968. Fire Support Base Carlo, Bien Hoa Province, South Vietnam. 2:30 hours. In the suffocating darkness of the Vietnamese night, 3 battalions of North Vietnamese Army regulars crept through the rubber plantation towards sleeping Australian gunners. Within minutes, the jungle would erupt in fire, steel, and blood. What happened next would become the defining moment of Australia's longest and bloodiest battle in Vietnam. This is the story of how 105mm howitzers, coordinated fire, and the iron discipline of Australian artillerymen stopped a regimental assault cold. Before we begin this journey into one of the most intense defensive battles of the Vietnam War, I need you to do something important. Hit that subscribe button right now for Vietnam War records. We're bringing you the real stories, the documented history, the battles that shaped the war. Every week, we dive deep into operations that changed everything. Don't miss a single episode. Subscribe, hit the notification bell, and let's explore this remarkable defensive stand together. The story begins not on May 16th but 4 days earlier when the Australians walked into a hornet's nest they didn't know existed. On May 12, 1968, the 1st Australian Task Force received orders to establish a fire support patrol base in an area 40 kilometers northeast of Saigon. The location was designated Fire Support Base Coral, situated 7 kilometers north of the town of Tan Nguyen. The mission seemed straightforward. American intelligence suggested the North Vietnamese Army was withdrawing from the Saigon area after their failed Mini-Tet offensive in early May. Small groups, low morale, disorganized retreat. That's what the briefing said. The Australians were to block withdrawal routes, intercept stragglers, disrupt any remaining enemy activity. It should have been a routine deployment. It wasn't. Lieutenant Colonel Philip Bennett commanded the 1st Battalion Royal Australian Regiment. A professional soldier who would eventually rise to become chief of the Australian Defence Force, Bennett was leading his battalion into an area that intelligence had catastrophically misread. The enemy wasn't withdrawing in small, demoralized groups. The North Vietnamese Army 7th Division was present in strength, spoiling for a fight, and about to deliver one of the most sustained ground assaults Australian forces would face in the entire war. But on that morning of May 12th, as Chinook helicopters thundered through the humid air, carrying troops and equipment into the landing zone, none of the Australians knew what was waiting. The deployment was chaos from the start. B Company of the 3rd Battalion Royal Australian Regiment was supposed to secure the initial landing zone at a location designated K-Pad, but an American air commander diverted them to a different location, 1,000 meters away. When the artillery reconnaissance parties landed 5 minutes later at the designated K-Pad, they found American troops from the 1st Infantry Division, the Big Red One, already on the ground. Airstrikes were being conducted to the west. Something was happening out there, something the intelligence briefings hadn't mentioned. The confusion multiplied when the Regimental Reconnaissance Party, including Major Brian Murtaugh, the second in command of the 12th Field Regiment, disappeared from the landing zone and couldn't be contacted by radio. They had moved off into the surrounding rubber plantation, allegedly because they believed they were at the wrong location. They weren't. But their absence at a critical moment meant that the orderly deployment of the artillery batteries, carefully planned and rehearsed, immediately began to unravel. Then the sky filled with helicopters. The New Zealand 161 Field Battery's guns arrived hours ahead of schedule. Chinooks packed the sky, each carrying a 105mm howitzer slung beneath. The guns needed to be landed immediately, but there was no designated area laid out, no gun markers positioned, no coordination in place. The gun position officer for 161 Battery, Lieutenant Rod Baldwin, sprinted into the rubber trees to mark positions while his guns were being lowered onto the landing zone. It was frantic, improvised, nothing like the careful regimental deployment that doctrine required. Lieutenant Ian Ahern, the gun position officer for 102 Field Battery, watched this chaos unfold. His battery's guns weren't scheduled until 12:30 hours, but with the New Zealand battery already landing and Major Murtaugh still missing somewhere in the jungle, Ahern knew they were in trouble. He finally managed radio contact with Murtaugh, who gave the unhelpful order to move to his location just up the track. In a former rubber plantation laced with dozens of tracks, that meant nothing. Ahern requested Murtaugh throw a smoke grenade. When the colored smoke billowed up through the canopy, Ahern took a compass bearing and marched into the trees with his team, leaving the landing zone behind. What Ahern found when he reached Murtaugh's position alarmed him. The spot Murtaugh had selected for 102 Battery was 1,500 meters from the landing zone where 161 Battery was establishing. 1,500 meters. In defensive terms, that was catastrophic. The two batteries would be unable to provide mutual support. The gaps would be impossible to defend properly. Any coordinated defense would be... Ahern pointed this out. Murtaugh was unmoved, insisting the space would be needed when the task force deployed. As Ahern, Second Lieutenant Bob Lowry, and gunner Jeff Dwyer moved through the rubber to determine accurate grid coordinates for the gun position, they discovered something that sent ice through their veins. 100 freshly dug, circular weapon pits. An AK-40, a lolly wrapper with Ho Chi Minh's image. These were signs of a disciplined enemy force that had rested here within the last 24 hours. A large force. An organized force. A force that was somewhere nearby. Ahern reported this vital information to Murtaugh immediately. Murtaugh told no one. By late afternoon, 102 batteries, 610mm howitzers were arriving by helicopter. The battery's bulldozer arrived in one of the last lifts, and the crew immediately began piling protective earth buns around the guns. But darkness was coming fast. They managed to complete the buns around guns 4, 5, and 6 on the northern side of the position before last light forced them to stop. Guns 1, 2, and 3 remained exposed, surrounded only by the shallow weapon pits the gunners had frantically dug during the afternoon. The 1st Battalion Mortar Platoon arrived at 1700 hours, just 1 hour before darkness. They were positioned on the northern flank of 102 Battery, approximately 50 meters from the nearest guns. Far from being isolated, as some accounts would later claim, the mortars essentially formed a 7th gun platform in the battery position. They were right there on the perimeter, right there when the enemy came. D Company of the 3rd Battalion, which was supposed to provide dedicated defense for the fire support base, had moved off to a position somewhere in the rubber. Nobody told 102 Battery or the mortar platoon exactly where D Company was located. As darkness fell on May 12th, the defensive situation at Fire Support Base Coral was a disaster waiting to happen. 2 artillery batteries separated by 1,500 meters. No orders issued for the defense of the base. No barbed wire erected because the wire had only just arrived. No claymore mines deployed because nobody knew where D Company was positioned. The command post staff and gunners had dug weapon pits. Some to stage 1 depth, 1.5 meters, others just shallow scrapes. But the position was woefully unprepared for what was coming through the darkness. Stand 2 came with last light, the practice where all work ceased and everyone watched their front in silence, anticipating possible enemy action. But the silence was immediately shattered by 105mm howitzers firing defensive fire missions for the rifle companies of 1st and 3rd Battalions, still deploying into their night positions. The guns roared through the evening, adjusting targets, registering defensive fires. When stand down came after the firing ceased, most of the exhausted gunners and mortarmen crawled into their weapon pits and collapsed into sleep. Machine gunners remained on watch. The sentries strained their eyes into the impenetrable blackness of the rubber plantation. Out there, beyond the perimeter, beyond the reach of their vision, something was moving. At 1809 hours, D Company 1st Battalion reported sighting enemy forces. A contact resulted. 1 North Vietnamese soldier killed, 1 Australian wounded. At 1936 hours, B Company reported firing at an enemy party without result. Then came the flares. A company reported 2 red flares fired from the jungle, acknowledged by 2 others from a different location. D Company reported green tracer being fired vertically into the air from multiple points around the perimeter. Green tracer. The sentries at 102 Battery saw it too. Bright green streaks lancing into the night sky. Green tracer was Allied troops used only red tracer. Those vertical green tracers were signals. Coordination. The enemy was communicating, organizing, preparing. Something big was coming. Around midnight, the machine gunner at the mortar platoon position opened fire on 3 enemy soldiers sighted at the edge of the perimeter. An enemy machine gun returned fire, green tracer snapping through the darkness. The regimental command post accused the mortar platoon of firing at them. Lieutenant Tony Jensen, the mortar line officer, replied tersely that he only had red tracer and the incoming fire was green. Stand 2 was ordered. Every man awake, weapons ready, eyes searching the night. Minutes passed, nothing. The tension was suffocating. Then Gradually, the alert was stood down. Most of the men went back to sleep. The machine gunners resumed their lonely vigil. The night pressed in, hot and humid and absolutely silent. At approximately 0215 hours, on May 13th, 12 platoon of D Company 1st Battalion, positioned in ambush 2,000 meters north of 102 Battery, opened fire on a group of enemy soldiers moving southwest toward Coral. The enemy response was instantaneous and devastating. A salvo of rocket-propelled grenades exploded in the trees above the platoon's position. RPGs were designed to penetrate armor, but when they detonated in jungle canopy, they transformed into giant fragmentation grenades. Shrapnel scythed through the platoon. In seconds, 11 men became casualties. Forward observer Gordon Alexander, the artillery officer attached to D Company, grabbed his radio handset and called a fire mission. Contact! Contact! Fire mission battery! The call roared over the tannoy system at 102 Battery. Gunners tumbled from weapon pits, wrestled the 22-ton howitzers around to the north, and began sending 105mm high explosive shells screaming into the darkness. The jungle erupted with explosions. 20 minutes of sustained fire before end of mission came back from Alexander. The battery recorded the final target as a defensive fire task, and the exhausted gun crews began cleaning up the expended shell casings around their platforms. Major Gavin Andrews, the battery commander, was worried. The activity around D Company concerned him, probably reflecting Lieutenant Colonel Bennett's own anxiety about his forward company. Andrews called for the gun position officer. Ahern came to the command post. Andrews asked if the battery could handle 2 final preventative fire tasks. These were critical defensive targets, guns laid and loaded, ready to fire immediately without any adjustment. The FPF was the last-ditch fire, the desperation mission when the enemy was right on top of friendly positions. It was agreed. Guns 1, 2, and 3 would be laid to the east covering B Company. Guns 4, 5, and 6 would be laid to the north covering D Company. The decision to split the battery this way, to orient 3 guns north, was pure luck. Those northern guns, the only 3 with protective earth buns, would soon face the enemy at point-blank range. The gun crews cleaned up the remaining brass and equipment around their platforms, but the detachment on gun number 4 stayed up. Coffee, cigarettes. Nobody could sleep now. That restlessness, that decision to stay awake would save lives. At approximately 0230 hours, fire support base Coral was engulfed in hell. The world exploded. RPGs, mortars, and machine gun fire erupted from the darkness with apocalyptic intensity. Gunners Mick Grimes and John Schwartzy were manning the machine gun positioned in front of gun number 6. They couldn't believe what they were seeing. 150 meters out, massed ranks of North Vietnamese infantry stood up from the darkness and came forward in waves. Grimes and Schwartzer opened up with their M60 machine gun. The weapon jammed. They cleared it. It jammed again. They cleared it. It jammed a 3rd time. Green tracer rounds snapped over their head. RPGs exploded behind them in the battery position. The enemy was everywhere. Grimes and Schwartzer fell back to the gun platform. The North Vietnamese assault wave followed them up onto the protective bund around gun 6. Desperate close-quarters fighting erupted on top of the howitzer. Grimes was hit by AK-47 fire, rounds stitching across his hand, but his self-loading rifle took the full burst and saved his life. Second Lieutenant Matt Cleland, the section commander, arrived at gun 6, emptied his pistol into the North Vietnamese soldiers on the bund, then sprinted to his weapon pit to retrieve his F1 submachine gun. In the chaos and darkness, the Australians dropped their M60 machine gun. The enemy was hurling grenades now. Gun Sergeant Max Franklin, recognizing that the position was being overrun, ordered his detachment to fall back to gun number 5. Before he withdrew, Franklin did something that showed the presence of mind combat leaders are made of. He removed the howitzer's firing pin and took it with him. Without that pin, the gun was useless. Franklin didn't tell anyone what he'd done. He just did it. That captured howitzer, gun number 6, would later be retaken in the morning and is now on display in the Australian War Memorial in Canberra. It never fired a single round for the enemy because Franklin took the firing pin. 2,000 meters north, Gordon Alexander, at D Company, was watching a very large stream of enemy soldiers moving south toward Coral. He called a fire mission. 1-4, Fire Mission Battery. The response from Lieutenant Ahern was terse and desperate. This call sign underground assault. Alexander could only reply, "Oh." At gun number 4, the detachment that had stayed awake scrambled for their personal weapons. Their machine gunner came sprinting back from the forward position. The Gun 4 crew opened with withering small arms fire on the enemy assault wave. Their gun was one of the three, with a protective earth bund. That bund made all the difference. They had cover. They had a firing platform. They poured disciplined fire into the massed enemy ranks. The North Vietnamese assault broke against Gun 4 like a wave hitting a rock. The mortar platoon was overrun immediately. Enemy soldiers surged through the mortar base plates, moving at speed through the position. Lieutenant Jensen called for fire from 161 Battery and the 3rd Battalion mortars located with them. He shouted to his platoon to fall back to gun number 5 of 192 Battery. In the darkness and confusion, the mortarmen fought their way back to the relative safety of the gun position. The regimental command post was in the thick of it. Colonel Dunstan and Major Andrews were coordinating fire missions while enemy soldiers probed the perimeter. Andrews was on the radio, organizing artillery support from every American battery in range. 9 batteries in total, including 161 Battery and what was left of 102 Battery still capable of firing. The night became an endless roar of explosions, green and red tracer crisscrossing the darkness, RPGs detonating, the sharp crack of AK-47s and the heavier bark of Australian SLRs and F-1 submachine guns. The battle raged for 4 hours. 4 hours of continuous combat. The enemy pressed the attack again and again. They reached the command. They penetrated into the battery position. But they could not hold what they briefed. The Australian gunners fought them with everything they had. Small arms, grenades, indirect fire from 161 Battery crashing down on the enemy, forming up areas, American artillery pounding the approaches. Slowly, gradually, the intensity of the enemy fire decreased. By 0630 hours, as the first grey light of dawn filtered through the smoke and dust, the enemy had withdrawn, dragging their dead and wounded with them. Gun numbers. The position was still Australian, but the cost had been terrible. 11 Australians dead, 28 wounded, 1 howitzer and 2 mortars damaged. The mortar platoon had been virtually destroyed as a fighting unit. The battery position was littered with unexploded ordnance, spent shell casings, blood, and the bodies of 52 North Vietnamese soldiers who lay strewn around the perimeter. Many more had been killed and dragged away during the withdrawal, evidenced by the blood trails and drag marks that disappeared into the jungle. In the aftermath of the first attack, the Australians took stock. The defensive layout had been poor, the result of a confused deployment and lack of coordination. But they had held. They had stopped a battalion-sized enemy assault force augmented by infiltration groups. Now the priority was to ensure it didn't happen again. M113 armored personnel carriers from A Squadron 3rd Cavalry Regiment arrived during the day, on May 13th. These APCs, under the command of Major John Blue Keldy, were split between the fire support bases. One troop was assigned to 1st Battalion at Coral. The M113s brought heavy .50 caliber machine guns and mobility. They would prove decisive in the next attack. The artillery registered more defensive fire targets. The infantry companies took up improved positions. Earth bunds were completed around the remaining guns. Barbed wire was Claymore mines were positioned. Communication was improved between all the elements of the base. Battalion headquarters, the gun batteries, the mortar platoon, the defending infantry and cavalry. Everyone now knew where everyone else was. The defensive coordination that should have existed on May 12th was now in. On May 15th, Fire Support Base Coral had become a strong defensive position, but the enemy wasn't finished. May 16th, 1968, 0230 hours. The North Vietnamese came again, this time with even greater force. 3 battalions, a full regimental-sized assault. The attack began with a heavy barrage of rocket-propelled grenades and mortar fire. The bombardment concentrated on A Company 1st Battalion and the artillery batteries. For 15 minutes the base was pounded. Explosions erupted across the... 2 Australians were killed in those first terrible minutes. Then came the infantry. From the darkness, North Vietnamese soldiers emerged in waves. The main assault was directed at A Company's position and the northeastern sector of the perimeter. Part of A Company's position was occupied by enemy forces. The situation was desperate. But this time the Australians were ready. A squadron's M113 armored personnel carriers roared into action. The heavy machine guns opened up, .50 caliber rounds tearing into the assault waves. The M113s maneuvered through the position, their crews fighting from the open hatches, engaging the enemy at close range. The noise was indescribable. The .50 caliber machine guns had a distinctive heavy hammering sound, each round the size of a man's finger, capable of tearing through concrete blocks. The APCs blocked enemy penetrations, sealed breaches in the perimeter, provided mobile fire support wherever the attack was heaviest. Major Keldy coordinated his squadron with the skill and aggression that would later earn recognition throughout the Australian Army. His APCs were everywhere, moving, fighting, refusing to yield ground. The infantry companies fought from their defensive positions with disciplined fire. A company was heavily engaged. Part of their position temporarily occupied, but the company commander held his men together, coordinated their fire, called for artillery support from forward observers embedded with the rifle platoons. The defensive fire missions came in rapid succession. Battery after battery responded. 102 Field Battery, despite the damage from the first attack, was firing continuously. 161 Battery, 1,500 meters away, was pouring high-explosive rounds into the registered defensive targets. The American batteries joined in. Major Gavin Andrews coordinated the fire of 9 artillery batteries, massing their fires on the enemy assault formations, breaking up their attacks before they could build momentum, smashing their forming up areas, interdicting their withdrawal routes. The forward observers were the critical link in this chain of destruction. Officers and senior NCOs embedded with the rifle companies, they were the eyes of the artillery. They could see the enemy. They knew where the threat was greatest. They called the fire missions that brought the 105mm and 105mm rounds screaming down on the North Vietnamese assault waves. Fire mission after fire mission. Target coordinates called in, adjusted, confirmed. Fire for effect. The jungle erupted with explosions. The Australian artillery was demonstrating what it could do when properly coordinated, when multiple batteries were massed on single targets, when experienced forward observers directed the fire. It was devastating. The North Vietnamese assault waves were caught in the open, exposed to indirect fire from the howitzers, direct fire from the M113s and infantry positions, and close air support from American helicopter gunships and fixed-wing ground attack aircraft that arrived overhead as the battle developed. The helicopters came in low and fast, rockets rippling from their pods, minigun fire pouring down at 6,000 rounds per minute. The fixed-wing aircraft delivered bombs and napalm on the enemy forming up areas and withdrawal routes. The combined arms integration was textbook. Artillery, infantry, armor, and air power working seamlessly together. This was what the Australian Army had trained for. This was combined arms warfare at its finest. And it was working. The enemy assault waves were being shattered. They pressed the attack for 4 hours of sustained combat. They penetrated into the perimeter. They occupied part of A Company's position. They fought with desperate courage, but they could not break through. They could not overrun the base the Australian defence was holding. Lieutenant Colonel Bennett coordinated the battle from his headquarters, receiving reports from his company commanders, orchestrating the movement of reinforcements, calling for additional artillery and air support. Major Andrews never left the fire direction centre, coordinating 9 artillery batteries, massing their fires where the threat was greatest, adjusting targets as the situation developed. Major Keldy's APCs were in constant motion, fighting from the open hatches, machine guns hammering, moving to wherever the enemy pressure was heaviest. The infantry platoon commanders and sergeants held their men together under fire, directed their defensive efforts, called for artillery when the enemy was massing for another push. By approximately 0630 hours, as dawn broke over fire support base Coral for the second time in 4 days, the enemy attack was faltering. The assault waves had been broken. The North Vietnamese began to withdraw, dragging their dead and wounded back into the jungle. The Australian defensive fire followed them, artillery rounds impacting on their withdrawal routes. Helicopter gunships pursuing the fleeing formations. When the firing finally ceased and silence returned to the scarred perimeter, the Australians assessed the damage. 5 men killed, 19 wounded. 2 members of the American artillery battery that had reinforced the base were also wounded. It was a terrible price, but infinitely better than what might have been if the regimental assault had succeeded in overrunning the position. The enemy casualties were difficult to assess precisely. 34 North Vietnamese bodies were recovered in and around the Australian positions. But the blood trails and drag marks indicated many more had been killed or wounded and removed during the withdrawal. Intelligence estimates suggested the North Vietnamese had suffered catastrophic casualties. A regimental-sized assault force, 3 battalions, had been hurled against a prepared defensive position and had been stopped cold. The artillery had been decisive. The massed fires from 9 batteries, coordinated by Major Andrews, had shattered the assault waves. The forward observers with the rifle companies had called the critical fire missions at exactly the right moments. The 105mm howitzers had delivered thousands of rounds onto the enemy formations. The combination of high explosive fragmentation, variable time fuses that detonated in the air above the target, and direct fire from the guns themselves had created a killing zone that the enemy could not survive. But artillery alone had not won the battle. It was the integration of all arms that made the defense successful. The M113 armored personnel carriers with their heavy machine guns had provided the mobile firepower that blocked enemy penetrations. The infantry companies had fought with disciplined courage from their defensive positions, holding the line when it mattered most. The air support had multiplied the effects of the ground fire, catching the enemy in the open during their withdrawal. And the leadership at every level, from Lieutenant Colonel Bennett down to the gun sergeants and section commanders, had held the defense together during 4 hours of sustained close-quarters combat. This was combined arms warfare as it was meant to be practiced, every element supporting every other element. Artillery supporting infantry, infantry holding positions that allowed APCs providing mobile firepower that protected both artillery and infantry, air power amplifying the effects of ground fire. It was a symphony of destruction, and it had stopped a regimental assault cold. Over the following days and weeks, the North Vietnamese would make additional attempts to attack Fire Support Base Coral and the newly established Fire Support Base Balmoral. On May 22nd, Coral was subjected to another rocket and mortar barrage, but the NVA troops forming up for the assault were dispersed by return fire from 1st Battalion's mortars before they could launch their attack. On May 26th and 28th, there were further bombardments and patrol contacts, but Coral was not seriously threatened again. The enemy had learned a costly lesson. Frontal assaults against prepared Australian defensive positions, backed by massed artillery fire, was suicide. Fire Support Base Balmoral, established on May 24th, approximately 4.5 kilometers north of Coral, by 3rd Battalion, was attacked on May 26th and 28th. Both assaults were thrown back with heavy enemy casualties. The pattern was the same: enemy bombardment followed by infantry assault. Australian defensive fire from artillery, mortars, and direct fire weapons breaking up the attacks. The integration of Centurion tanks, which arrived as reinforcements on May 23rd, further strengthened the defensive capabilities of the Australian bases. On May 26th, the tanks went outside the perimeter wire with infantry support and destroyed a North Vietnamese bunker system that had been discovered. The enemy was on the defensive now, trying to avoid contact, withdrawing from the area. The Battle of Coral Balmoral officially concluded on June 6, 1968. It had lasted 26 days. It was the longest and bloodiest battle Australian forces fought in the entire Vietnam War. Over the 4-week period, the Australians accounted for over 300 enemy soldiers confirmed killed. Hundreds of enemy weapons were captured, but the cost to the Australians had been 26 men dead, over 100 wounded, 2 from 12th Field Regiment, 1 from 104 Signals, 16 from 1st Battalion, 6 from 3rd Battalion, 1 from 161 Independent Reconnaissance Squadron. These were not just statistics. They were sons, husbands, fathers, brothers. They were professional soldiers who had done their duty under the most extreme circumstances. They had held positions that many military analysts later concluded should have been overrun. They had stopped multiple regimental-sized assaults. They had demonstrated the effectiveness of Australian military doctrine and training, and they had paid for that success with their lives and blood. The artillery had been at the center of the defense. The 105mm howitzers of 102 Field Battery and 161 Battery had fired thousands of rounds during the battle. The gun crews had worked under direct enemy fire, wrestling the heavy guns around to new targets, loading and firing as fast as humanly possible, never flinching even when RPGs and mortars were exploding around their positions. Major Gavin Andrews, the commander of 102 Battery, had coordinated the fires of 9 artillery batteries with skill and precision that became legendary in the Australian Army. His ability to mass fires from multiple batteries, to shift fires rapidly as the tactical situation changed, to maintain communication and coordination even during the most intense moments of the battle, was a masterclass in artillery command. The forward observers embedded with the rifle companies had been equally critical. Officers like Gordon Alexander, who had called fire missions while his platoon was being torn apart by RPGs, had provided the accurate target information that made the artillery effective. Without those forward observers, the guns would have been firing blind, unable to engage the most critical targets. The integration of the forward observers with the infantry companies and their direct link to the fire direction centers controlling the artillery batteries was what made the Australian system so effective. The M113 armoured personnel carriers under Major Keldy's command had proven that armoured vehicles could be decisive in static defensive operations. Many military theorists had doubted the value of APCs in defensive roles, arguing that they were vulnerable to RPGs and anti-tank weapons in close terrain. The Battle of Coral proved those doubts wrong. The M113s, with their .50 caliber machine guns and mobility, had been able to move rapidly to threaten points on the perimeter, to block enemy penetrations, to provide heavy suppressive fire that broke up assault waves. The APC crews had fought from open hatches, exposed to enemy fire, but their vehicles had given them protection and firepower that dismounted infantry could not match. The combination of infantry, artillery, and armor, all working together under unified command, had created a defensive capability that the North Vietnamese simply could not overcome. This was the lesson of Coral Balmoral. Combined arms integration, proper coordination, experienced leadership, and disciplined soldiers could defeat a numerically superior enemy, even when that enemy was willing to accept horrific casualties to achieve his objectives. The North Vietnamese perspective on the battle has been more difficult to document. Communist forces rarely published detailed accounts of their defeats, and the Battle of Coral Balmoral was unquestionably a defeat for the NVA 7th Division. But from captured documents and later interviews with enemy soldiers, it became clear that the North Vietnamese commanders had not anticipated the level of resistance they encountered. They had expected to overrun the Australian positions through surprise and mass. The bold assault on the night of May 12-13 had nearly succeeded. The defences were incomplete, coordination was poor, and the enemy had achieved surprise. But even then, the Australian soldiers had fought with such ferocity that the attack had been stopped. The second assault on May 16 had been even more carefully planned. 3 battalions, a full regiment, supported by infiltration groups, a heavy preparatory bombardment, detailed reconnaissance of the Australian positions, night assault to exploit the confusion and limited visibility. Everything the North Vietnamese tactical doctrine prescribed for attacking a fortified position. And it had failed. Failed because the Australians were ready. Failed because the artillery coordination was superb. Failed because the combined arms integration was seamless. Failed because the Australian soldiers at every level, from the battalion commander down to the gunners loading shells, had done their jobs with professional competence and personal courage. The North Vietnamese learned from this failure. After Coral Balmoral, enemy tactics shifted. Frontal assaults against prepared Australian positions became rare. The NEA and Viet Cong increasingly relied on ambushes, mining, and indirect fire rather than sustained infantry assaults. The Australians had earned a reputation that the enemy respected and feared. The strategic significance of the Battle of Coral Balmoral extended beyond the tactical results. The battle had taken place during Operation Ton Thang, the combined Allied offensive aimed at destroying enemy forces threatening Saigon. The Australian success at blocking enemy withdrawal routes and inflicting heavy casualties had contributed to the larger operations objectives. The North Vietnamese 7th Division had been mauled. Its combat effectiveness had been significantly reduced. The division's ability to threaten Saigon or conduct large-scale operations in the Three Corps area had been compromised. While the overall strategic situation in Vietnam would continue to deteriorate for the Allied forces over the coming years, the Battle of Coral Balmoral demonstrated that Australian tactical methods were effective. The emphasis on patrolling, the integration of combined arms, the fire support base concept combined with aggressive operations outside the wire, all of these elements of Australian doctrine had proven their worth. The battle also validated the decision to deploy Australian forces to Vietnam as part of the broader Allied effort. The Australians were pulling their weight. They were conducting professional military operations. They were achieving tactical success. Whatever questions might be raised about the strategic wisdom of the Vietnam War, there could be no question about the tactical competence of the Australian soldiers who fought there. For the soldiers who survived Coral Balmoral, the experience was searing. Many carried the psychological scars for the rest of their lives. Post-traumatic stress disorder was not well understood in 1968. Soldiers were expected to simply endure, to carry on, to not speak about what they had seen and done. Many of the veterans of Coral Balmoral struggled for decades with nightmares, survivor's guilt, anger, and depression. The Australian government and society were slow to recognize the sacrifices these men had made. Vietnam veterans returned to a country that was increasingly ambivalent about the war. There were no ticker-tape parades, no national celebrations. Many veterans felt that their service was not valued, that the country they had fought for did not appreciate what they had endured. It would take decades before Australian society began to properly recognize and honor the Vietnam veterans. The Battle of Coral Balmoral gradually became better known. Documentaries were produced. The captured howitzer and the Australian War Memorial became a tangible link to the battle, a physical reminder of what had happened. Veterans organizations worked to ensure that the men who had fought at Coral and Balmoral received the recognition they deserved. Battle honors were awarded to the units involved. Medals were presented to individuals whose actions had been particularly courageous. But for many veterans, the greatest recognition came not from official awards, but from the simple acknowledgement that they had done their duty under extreme circumstances, and had done it well. The artillery aspect of the battle has particular significance in military history. The coordination of 9 artillery batteries, some Australian, some New Zealand, some American, to provide massed fires on a single battlefield, demonstrated what could be achieved with proper fire support coordination. Major Gavin Andrews became a case study in artillery command. His ability to rapidly assess the tactical situation, identify critical targets, and mass the fires of multiple batteries without confusion or fratricide was exactly what artillery doctrine prescribed, but was rarely achieved in the chaos of actual combat. The Fire Direction Center at 1702 Battery became the nerve center for the entire defensive operation. Every fire mission was processed through that command post. Every target was coordinated to ensure that fires from different batteries did not conflict. The technical expertise required to accomplish this, especially while the command post itself was under direct enemy fire, cannot be overstated. The signalers maintaining radio communications, the command post officers calculating firing data, the surveyors ensuring accurate target coordinates, the ammunition handlers ensuring a constant flow of shells to the guns. Every element of the artillery system had to function perfectly. And at Coral, it did. This was what years of training and professional development produced. When the test came, when lives depended on the guns firing accurately and rapidly, the Australian artillery passed with distinction. The infantry's contribution to the victory cannot be overstated. Lieutenant Colonel Bennett's leadership of 1st Battalion was exemplary. His company commanders, particularly those leading A Company and D Company during the most intense fighting, held their units together under sustained enemy assault. The platoon sergeants and section commanders, the NCO leadership that forms the backbone of any infantry unit, maintained discipline and fire control even when enemy soldiers were inside their positions. The individual riflemen, many of them young conscripts on their first deployment, fought with courage and determination that veterans of previous wars would have recognized and respected. The Australian infantry had a reputation in Vietnam. The Americans called them the best jungle fighters in the world. The North Vietnamese and Viet Cong learned to avoid contact with Australian patrols. At Coral Balmoral, the infantry validated that reputation. They held positions that should have been overrun. They fought at close quarters with grenades and bayonets when the enemy reached their weapon pits. They called for artillery fire on their own positions when it was the only way to break enemy assaults. This was infantry combat at its most brutal and unforgiving, and the Australian infantry prevailed. The role of the M113 Armoured Personnel Carriers and A Squadron, 3rd Cavalry Regiment, deserves special emphasis. Major John Blue Keldy's leadership of his squadron during the May 16th attack was masterful. The APCs were in constant motion, engaging enemy soldiers who had penetrated the perimeter, blocking assault routes, providing mobile firepower that the infantry could not match. The .50 caliber heavy machine guns mounted on the M113s had devastating effects on massed infantry formations. The psychological impact of the APCs moving through the defensive position, their machine guns hammering, was significant for both Australian defenders and North Vietnamese attackers. The Australians saw mobile reinforcements arriving wherever the attack was heaviest. The enemy saw armoured vehicles rolling toward them through the smoke and darkness. The M131 was not a tank. Its armor was thin, vulnerable to RPGs and heavy machine guns. But in the close terrain of the rubber plantation, with limited visibility and confused fightings, the M113's mobility and firepower were decisive. The cavalry crews fought from open hatches, exposed to enemy fire, but their courage and skill made the difference between a successful defense and catastrophic defeat. After Coral Balmoral, the Australian use of M113 APCs in Vietnam became more aggressive. The vehicles were no longer seen merely as battle taxis to transport infantry. They were recognized as combat vehicles capable of independent action and decisive impact on the battlefield. The American artillery support deserves recognition. The 155mm howitzers of A Battery, 2nd Battalion, 35th Artillery Regiment, provided heavy fire support during both attacks. The coordination between American and Australian fire direction centers was seamless. The various American artillery batteries in range that contributed to the massed fires during the May 16th attack demonstrated the kind of inter-allied cooperation that was supposed to characterize the Vietnam War, but was not always achieved in practice. At Coral, it worked. American and Australian gunners spoke the same language, used compatible procedures, and worked toward the same objectives. The result was a devastating concentration of firepower that the enemy could not withstand. This kind of cooperation between Allied forces was not automatic. It required training, liaison, mutual respect, and professional competence. The artillery community in Vietnam, both American and Australian, had developed strong working relationships over years of deployment. Those relationships paid dividends at Coral. The New Zealand contribution through 161 Field Battery was significant. The New Zealanders had deployed to Vietnam as part of the broader ANZAC commitment to the Allied effort. 1061 Battery was equipped with the same 105mm howitzers as the Australian batteries, used the same procedures, and was fully integrated into the Australian artillery structure. During both attacks on Coral, 161 Battery provided continuous fire support despite being separated from 102 Battery by 1,500 meters. The battery's position at the southwestern end of the defensive complex made it vulnerable, but the New Zealand gunners held their ground and kept firing throughout both battles. The Anzac military tradition, forged at Gallipoli in 1915 and reinforced through 2 world wars, continued at Coral Balmoral. Australian and New Zealand soldiers fighting side by side, supporting each other, achieving together what neither could have accomplished alone. The battle added another chapter to a military partnership that continues to this day. The tactical lessons of Coral Balmoral were studied by military analysts around the world. The importance of combined arms integration, the decisive role of artillery when properly coordinated, the value of armored vehicles in defensive operations, the critical importance of adequate preparation time for defensive positions, the need for clear command relationships, and coordinated defensive planning. The Battle of Coral became a case study taught at military academies and staff colleges. The mistakes made during the initial deployment on May 12th were analyzed as examples of what not to do. The effective defense on May 16th was studied as a model of combined arms warfare. The coordination of 9 artillery batteries by a single fire direction center became a teaching point in artillery schools. Major Andrews' fire coordination, Lieutenant Colonel Bennett's tactic, Major Keldy's mobile defense. All of these became examples of professional military competence that future officers were expected to study and emulate. For the Australian Army, Coral Balmoral vindicated the tactical doctrine that had been developed over years of operations in Vietnam. The Fire Support Patrol Base concept, with its emphasis on aggressive patrolling combined with strong artillery support, had proven effective. The integration of armored vehicles into infantry operations had worked. The emphasis on realistic training, on professional NCO leadership, on combined arms coordination, all of these elements of Australian military culture had been validated under the most extreme test. The battle also reinforced the Australian Army's confidence in its own methods. The Americans operated differently, with their emphasis on overwhelming firepower and search-and-destroy operations. The Australians operated with more emphasis on intelligence, patrolling, and controlled use of firepower. Both approaches had their strengths and weaknesses, but at Coral Balmoral, the Australian approach had worked. A relatively small force, properly trained and led, with excellent fire support coordination, had defeated a much larger enemy force that was willing to accept enormous casualties. This was exactly what Australian tactical doctrine was designed to achieve. The enemy perspective, as reconstructed from later documents and interviews, revealed that the North Vietnamese commanders had been shocked by their losses at Coral Balmoral. The NVA 7th Division had been considered an elite formation. It had conducted successful operations during the Tet Offensive. Its soldiers were experienced, well-trained, highly motivated. But at Coral, The division had suffered catastrophic casualties for no strategic gain. The Australian positions had not been overrun, the enemy had not achieved his, and the cost in North Vietnamese lives had been staggering. The division required months to rebuild its combat strength. Its effectiveness as an operational unit was significantly compromised. For the North Vietnamese High Command, this was a sobering lesson. The Australians were not the weak link in the Allied chain. They could not be steamrolled through mass assault. They were a professional military force that fought with skill and determination. Future operations would need to account for this reality. The shift in enemy tactics after Balmoral, away from frontal assaults and toward more indirect methods, reflected this hard-learned lesson. The political dimension of the battle was complex. By May 1968, the Vietnam War had become deeply controversial in Australia. The conscription system was under attack. Anti-war protests were growing. The government was facing increasing pressure to withdraw Australian forces. In this environment, the Battle of Balmoral presented a challenge. On one hand, it was a clear tactical victory. Australian soldiers had fought with courage and skill. They had defeated a larger enemy force. This was the kind of success that should have generated public support for the war effort. On the other hand, the casualties were significant. 26, over 100 wounded. For a country of Australia's population, these losses were substantial, and they occurred at a time when public support for the war was eroding. The government tried to highlight the tactical success while minimizing the casualties. The media coverage was mixed. Some outlets emphasized the victory, others focused on the losses. For the general public, the Battle of Balmoral became another data point in the ongoing debate about Vietnam. For those who supported the war, it demonstrated that Australian soldiers were fighting effectively and deserved support. For those who opposed the war, it demonstrated the ongoing cost of a conflict that seemed to have no end. The political impact of the battle was therefore ambiguous, neither significantly strengthening nor weakening public support for Australia's involvement in Vietnam. For the soldiers who fought at Balmoral, the political debate was largely irrelevant. They had been sent to Vietnam by their government. They had been given a mission. They had accomplished that mission under extraordinarily difficult circumstances. Whether the war was justified, whether the strategy was sound, whether the costs were worth the results, these were questions for politicians and historians. The soldiers' job was to fight, to hold the line, to protect their mates, to accomplish the mission, and they had done that. The bonds formed during those 26 days of combat were unbreakable. The men who fought at Balmoral shared an experience that civilians could never fully understand. They had looked death in the face. They had seen friends killed. They had killed enemy soldiers. They had experienced terror, exhaustion, pain, grief, and triumph. These shared experiences created a brotherhood that transcended politics. Veterans of Balmoral would gather for decades afterward, maintaining contact, supporting each other, remembering the fallen. For them, the battle was not a political statement or a historical event. It was a defining moment in their lives, an experience that shaped who they were and who they would become. The artillery at Balmoral had stopped a regimental assault through a combination of factors. Volume of fire, with 9 batteries coordinated to deliver maximum rounds on target. Accuracy, with pre-registered defensive targets, and experienced forward observers calling the critical missions. Responsiveness, with fire missions answered within seconds. Sustained fire, maintaining continuous bombardment throughout the 4-hour engagement. And combined effects, with artillery integrated with direct fire from infantry, APCs, and close air support. This was artillery warfare as it was meant to be practiced. The howitzers were not operating in isolation. They were part of a combined, but they were the decisive arm. Without the massed artillery fires breaking up the enemy assault waves, the infantry and APCs would have been overwhelmed. The North Vietnamese were willing to accept enormous casualties. They pressed their attacks with courage and determination, but they could not advance through the curtain of high-explosive steel that the Australian artillery created. The 105mm howitzers of 102 Field Battery and 161 Battery, supported by American 155mm guns, delivered thousands of rounds during the May 16th battle. Each round weighed approximately 33 pounds for the 105mm shells. Each created a lethal fragmentation pattern that could kill or wound exposed personnel within a 50-meter radius. When multiple batteries fired on the same target, the effects were multiplicative. The ground became a churned moonscape of overlapping craters. Nothing could survive in that zone, and the forward observers kept calling the fire missions, adjusting onto new targets as the enemy massed for another assault, walking the artillery fire along the enemy approach routes, catching the North Vietnamese in the open where they were most vulnerable. This was the art of artillery warfare, and the Australian gunners had mastered it. The story of Fire Support Base Coral and the regimental assault on May 16, 1968, is ultimately a story about soldiers, about artillerymen who loaded shells until their hands bled, who fired their guns until the barrels glowed red, who never stopped even when RPGs were exploding around their positions, about infantry who held defensive positions against overwhelming odds, who fought with grenades and bayonets when the enemy reached their lines, who refused to yield ground, about cavalry crews who drove their APCs toward the sound of heaviest fighting, who exposed themselves to enemy fire from open hatches, who brought mobile firepower to wherever it was needed most, about commanders who made split-second decisions that saved lives, who coordinated complex operations under fire, who led from the front, about forward observers who called fire missions while their own positions were being overrun, about medics who treated wounded under fire, about signalers who maintained communications when the radios were damaged, about every soldier who did his duty during those terrible hours when survival was measured in seconds and victory depended on everyone doing their job perfectly. That's what happened at Fire Support Base Coral on May 16, 1968. Professional soldiers, well-trained and well-led, executing their doctrine under the most extreme combat conditions. And through their skill, courage, and determination, they stopped a regimental assault that should have overrun their positions. That is the story of how Australian artillery stopped a regimental NVA assault. Before we close, I want you to remember something. The men who fought at Balmoral were ordinary Australians. Some were regulars, professional soldiers who had chosen the military as a career. Others were national servicemen, conscripts who had been called up and sent to war. They came from cities and farms, from wealthy families and poor families, from every corner of Australia. What united them was not their backgrounds but their training, their leadership, and their determination to protect their mates. When the enemy came through the darkness on May 16, 1968, these ordinary men did extraordinary things. They stood their ground. They fought with skill and courage. They held the line. And they won. That's the legacy of Fire Support Base Coral. That's what we remember. That's what we honor. If you found this documentary valuable, if you learned something about this remarkable battle, then do something for me right now. Hit that subscribe button for Vietnam War Records. Share this video with anyone interested in military history. Leave a comment below telling us what you thought. These stories need to be told. These men need to be remembered. Their sacrifices need to be. Every week we're bringing you more deep dives into the battles, operations, and soldiers that defined the Vietnam War. Don't miss a single episode. Subscribe now, and thank you for watching. For the men who fought at Balmoral, for the 26 who never came home, we remember, lest we forget.